Today we set aside gear reviews and training tips to confront a disturbing reality. The federal government has distorted statistics to minimize the impact of armed citizens in stopping mass shootings. For more than a decade, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, has issued reports claiming that civilian interventions are rare. Anti-gun politicians and major media outlets repeat those figures to argue for new restrictions, telling you that the idea of a good guy with a gun is a myth. Yet independent researchers have exposed a very different story. By revisiting the same incidents and uncovering overlooked cases, they show that armed citizens are far more effective than the FBI admits. This script reconstructs that story, explains how official data are manipulated, and underscores why private gun ownership remains a vital line of defense against mass killers. In its reports on active shooter incidents from 2014 through 2024, the FBI asserts that there were 374 such events nationwide, and that armed citizens stopped just 14 of them. That translates to a success rate of roughly 3.7%. These numbers appear routinely in press stories and policy debates. Headlines from major outlets like the Associated Press and Reuters proclaim that it is rare for a bystander to end a shooting. Gun control advocates seize upon these figures to argue that carrying a gun serves little purpose. They characterize the idea of a responsible citizen who stops a massacre as an urban legend. But these figures are built on shaky foundations. To begin with, the FBI uses a narrow definition of active shooter. It includes only those incidents in which one or more individuals actively kill or attempt to kill people in a public place, excluding events related to other criminal activities, such as robberies or gang fights. Shootings during domestic disputes, drug deals, or other crimes, even if carried out in public, are omitted. The FBI also disregards cases where a potential attacker was stopped by an armed citizen before firing a shot. Under this definition, a civilian who draws a gun and causes an attacker to flee without harm is not counted. Consequently, many defensive actions vanish from the official record. Disturbed by what seemed like an undercount, economist John R. Lott Jr., a former advisor to the U.S. Department of Justice, and his colleagues at the Crime Prevention Research Center, CPRC, decided to audit the FBI reports. Using the same definition of active shooter, they combed through local news accounts, police statements, and court filings from the same period. Their investigation found 561 incidents, meaning the FBI overlooked or misclassified roughly 187 cases. More strikingly, they identified 202 incidents in which armed citizens stopped the attacker, yielding a success rate of about 36%. That is nearly 10 times higher than the FBI's 3.7%. The discrepancy raises obvious questions. Why were so many events missed? CPRC researchers note that the success rate of civilian interventions has trended upward over time. This rise corresponds with more permit holders and greater public awareness, suggesting that ordinary people are increasingly willing and able to intervene before police arrive. Two main issues explain the gulf between the FBI's figure and CPRC's data: restrictive definitions and flawed data collection. The FBI concedes that its reports are not comprehensive and are intended only to provide a baseline understanding. It relies on a team at Texas State University who often scour Google for news stories. If an incident receives only local coverage or no media attention, it may never appear in the FBI's list. Moreover, any shooting linked to a domestic dispute or a robbery is automatically excluded, regardless of how many bystanders were at risk. As a result, hundreds of real-world attacks fall outside the FBI's scope. Misclassification compounds the problem. Some citizens who volunteer to provide security at churches, supermarkets, or schools are labeled as security guards rather than ordinary civilians. For example, in December 2019, a gunman opened fire at the West Freeway Church of Christ near Fort Worth, Texas. Jack Wilson, a congregant acting as volunteer security, drew his pistol and stopped the attacker within seconds. The FBI listed this incident as a case of security personnel intervening. By recategorizing Wilson as a guard, the Bureau avoided counting the episode as a civilian intervention, even though dozens of parishioners were also armed and there was no paid security staff. In other instances, FBI narratives acknowledge that a concealed carry permit holder confronted a shooter and caused him to flee, yet the summary table credits police with ending the incident.
Another blind spot involves no-shot interventions. These are situations where a would-be attacker never fires because a citizen displays a firearm. CPRC tracks such incidents separately and does not include them in its 36% figure to ensure a fair comparison with the FBI's criteria. Still, these events are powerful evidence of deterrence. A gun drawn in defense can halt an attack before lives are lost. CPRC also found 42 cases where armed civilians thwarted what likely would have become mass shootings, and another 145 active shooter incidents omitted entirely. These omissions underscore how many life-saving acts the official reports miss. One of the most telling patterns emerges when separating incidents by location. Approximately half of active shootings occur in so-called gun-free zones, churches, theaters, schools, and malls that prohibit firearms. When CPRC excluded attacks in these zones and looked only at places where lawful carry is allowed, the success rate of civilian interventions jumped to 52.5%. In 2024 alone, that figure reached 62.5%. In other words, in locations where it was legal for citizens to carry firearms, they stopped more than half of all potential or active mass shootings. The reason is simple. Killers prefer unarmed victims. Several shooters have left behind manifestos in which they admit avoiding venues with armed security or armed patrons. When theaters, schools, or stores advertise themselves as gun-free, attackers know there will be little resistance. Conversely, when citizens are allowed to carry, a killer must assume his potential targets might shoot back. Thus, repealing policies that disarmed law-abiding citizens could deter attacks and increase the odds of stopping them when they occur. Researchers back this up. Surveys of criminologists and economists conducted by CPRC rank the elimination of gun-free zones among the most effective policies to stop mass shootings. Allowing teachers to carry concealed firearms, letting off-duty military personnel remain armed on base, and reducing pressure on businesses to impose gun bans also scored highly. When experts and data converge on the same conclusion, that lawful carry makes everyone safer, it becomes harder to justify wide-ranging gun-free zones. The FBI's undercount is amplified by media practices. Since the Bureau relies on news reports to compile its data, and national outlets in turn cite the FBI's figures, an insidious feedback loop forms. When a citizen hero stops a shooter, the story may appear only in local papers. National publications rarely highlight such acts. If they do, they often emphasize how rare the intervention was. A particularly egregious example came from the 2022 Greenwood Park Mall shooting in Indiana, where a 22-year-old named Elisha Dicken used his concealed pistol to stop an attacker who had already killed 3 people. Local police praised Dicken as tactically brilliant, but national outlets were quick to frame the story as an anomaly. Because few nationwide stories surface, the researchers working for the FBI miss many defensive uses, and the final reports reinforce the perception of rarity. Moreover, many defensive gun uses go unreported to police if no shots are fired. A would-be attacker flees, no one is hurt, and the citizen returns home. These interventions never make headlines, let alone official statistics. CPRC notes that such cases likely push the true success rate even higher. Consider 2 largely ignored examples: a permit holder at a back-to-school event in Florida who stopped a gunman before he could harm children, and another in a South Carolina nightclub who shot an attacker before more victims were hit. Authorities credited both citizens with saving lives, yet national coverage was sparse. As long as major media and the FBI rely on the same limited pool of stories, the myth of the ineffectiveness of armed citizens will persist. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this controversy is institutional inertia. Academic critiques of the FBI's active shooter reports date back to 2015. In 2022, Real Clear Investigations published a comprehensive analysis showing the FBI had missed dozens of cases, yet the Bureau responded by adding only a handful of incidents, and then in its 2023-2024 report claimed that no active shootings were stopped by civilians. In contrast, CPRC identified 121 active shooter cases in those 2 years and found that 45 were ended by armed citizens. This isn't the first time such warnings have been ignored. As early as 2015, scholars noted flaws in the FBI's methodology, but their critiques were dismissed. When Real Clear Investigations exposed the undercount in 2022, the article detailed a long list of omissions and called for an audit. Instead of opening its books, the FBI quietly revised only a few cases and left most untouched. 3 years later, Real Clear observed that the Bureau had acknowledged just 3 additional civilian interventions, despite CPRC documenting 78 such cases in the same period. That 26-fold discrepancy highlights systemic problems. The FBI has the ability to correct errors, but declines to do so. The refusal to update known mistakes, even when confronted with evidence, suggests a reluctance to present a full picture of how armed citizens contribute to public safety. Crime experts have expressed concern. Carl Moody of William and Mary warns that if the FBI will not correct obvious omissions, its crime statistics cannot be trusted. Gary Mouser, an emeritus professor at Simon Fraser University, notes that the errors almost always cut in one direction. They minimize the life-saving actions of armed citizens. This pattern suggests more than mere oversight. It indicates an institutional bias against acknowledging that ordinary people can and do save lives with their own firearms. When an agency refuses to update data, even after researchers and journalists identify missing cases, public confidence suffers.
These findings have profound practical implications. In a mass shooting, every second counts. Police response can be delayed by minutes. The difference between 5 and 10 minutes could mean dozens of lives. During that window, the only people who can stop the carnage are those already on scene. CPRC's review of incidents found no cases where an armed citizen accidentally shot an innocent bystander. Only one tragedy occurred in which police mistakenly shot a citizen hero in Colorado in 2021. But there have been no recorded incidents of permit holders harming bystanders. This data contradicts claims that armed citizens are as dangerous as attackers. Public opinion and professional experience also support the case for citizen defenders. A 2022 Trafalgar Group poll showed that 42% of American voters believe armed citizens are the most effective way to protect themselves and their family in a mass shooting, compared with 25% who look to local police and 10% who trust federal agents. A YouGov survey the same year found that a majority of Americans favor allowing teachers and school staff to carry firearms. Among law enforcement professionals, the support is even stronger. A survey of 380,000 active duty and 70,000 retired officers found that 86% believe casualties at school shootings could be reduced or avoided entirely if citizens with concealed carry permits were present. Seasoned officers like Sarasota County Sheriff Kurt Hoffman point out that perpetrators choose the time and place of their attacks and will simply wait until uniformed personnel leave. Masad Ayub, a veteran trainer of police and civilians, reminds us that when seconds count, the real first responders are the citizens present. The gap between 3.7% and 36% is not a trivial statistical quibble. It is the difference between myth and reality. When gun-free zones are removed from the equation, armed citizens stop more than half of potential or actual shootings. In 2024, that rate reached 62.5%. These numbers demonstrate that lawful gun owners play a crucial role in public safety. Yet official reports ignore or miscategorize many of their victories, and large news organizations amplify the misleading 3.7% figure. Bad data leads to bad policy. If legislators are told that civilian interventions almost never occur, they will feel emboldened to restrict lawful carry and expand gun-free zones, ironically, making mass shootings more likely. Fixing this problem requires several steps. First, defenders of the Second Amendment must continue to champion accurate data and highlight studies like those of the CPRC. Second, the FBI and its contractors should embrace transparency and correct errors as they are identified. Public trust in crime statistics depends on honesty. Third, policymakers should reconsider blanket gun-free zones and permit qualified citizens to carry in schools, churches, and other targets. The data shows that doing so saves lives. Ultimately, we must recognize that security is a shared responsibility. The government cannot be everywhere. During the critical first moments of an attack, the people already present, armed and trained, are the only ones who can intervene. In a democratic society, the Second Amendment is not a historical curiosity, it is a life-saving tool. CPRC's research reveals that in roughly 1 out of every 3 active shooter attacks, an armed citizen makes the difference. When gun-free zones are removed, the success rate climbs to a majority. Relying on the 3.7% figure to justify disarming ordinary people is not merely mistaken, it is dangerous. If we remain silent, misguided policies will continue to turn schools, theaters, and churches into soft targets. The choice before us is clear. Trust the distorted narrative and let the numbers lull us into complacency, or insist on honest data and protect the right of citizens to defend themselves and others. What is at stake is not an abstract debate about statistics, but the lives of everyday Americans. Legislators craft laws based on information from agencies like the FBI. If that information understates how often citizens save lives, policymakers may feel justified in expanding gun-free zones or banning firearms in more venues.
Measures built on the false premise that civilians rarely intervene can leave more people defenseless. Ignoring or burying the success stories of armed defenders deprives future victims of the help that could come from a neighbor or stranger willing to intervene. Demanding transparency is not about winning an argument, it is about preserving a fundamental right and ensuring that those who stop violence are counted.